December 17, 1897, The Morning News, Muncie, Indiana. Magic Hazel Twig. A scientist makes a study of the divining rod. Interesting investigations by Professor W.F. Barrett of the Royal College of Science for Ireland. Psychic phenomena connected with dowsing. The notion that you could detect the existence and position of a stream of water flowing underground at a depth of 100 feet or more by the peculiar behavior of a hazel twig held in your fingers has been looked upon in modern times as a ridiculous superstition. Scientific people, and particularly the geologists, have discredited all stories of this sort so long and so decidedly that other folk have been ashamed to evince faith in them. Now, however, a professor of physics in the Royal College of Science for Ireland, approaching the subject with a distinct prejudice antagonistic to the theory, has been led to change his mind by an extended investigation. His name is W.F. Barrett, and the subtitle of the treatise in which is embodied the result is A Scientific and Historical Research as to the Existence and Practical Value of a Particular Human Faculty Unrecognized by Science, locally known as dowsing. The first great step in this work was to collect all available narratives in regard to the use of the divining rod. In time, Professor Barrett was confronted with an amazing quantity of evidence. Scores, if not hundreds, of these tales are given in his treatise. Here are 3 samples. Sanitarium was to be built on high ground in Somersetshire, England. The site was apparently a dry one. 3 professional dowsers were sent for separately, each unknown to the others and each working under the conviction that he alone was employed. All 3 pointed to the same spot. A well was sunk there and abundant water was found. William Ward Spink, a justice in British Columbia, walked about over his grounds for an hour, blindfolded and carrying a divining rod in his fingers. Every time the wand dipped, an attendant drove a peg into the earth. In many cases, the justice would pass over a spot where the rod had moved before, and it would invariably give the same sign again. He dug wells at only 2 of the places indicated, but got water in both. This man declared that if he stood over a garden hose with a divining rod in his fingers, he could tell by its conduct when the water was turned on and off. At Newport, Monmouthshire, a well was sunk to a depth of 51 feet without success. Local experts, noting the character of the soil, then pronounced the quest hopeless. A Cornishman who was present advocated a trial of the divining rod, with which his boy, aged 11, had had some successful experience. The lad was sent for. In his hands, the twig gave distinct signs, but the people who would have to pay for the excavation were skeptical and hesitated. The Cornishman offered to take the contract himself and stipulated that he would demand no pay if no water was found. The job proceeded on that basis. At a depth of 48 feet, the diggers struck a gushing vein and were obliged to flee for their lives. The typical divining rod is shaped somewhat like a wishbone and is about a foot long. The tip of one prong is held in each hand, and the hands are kept 8 or 10 inches apart. The elbows are usually in contact with one's sides, and the forearms extend straight forward horizontally. The twig itself stands almost vertically in front of the dowser's chest. In the majority of cases reported, the upper part of the rod swayed toward the operator's body, but in a few instances it moved in the other direction, namely downward toward the earth. The violence of the movement seemed to vary greatly. If the twig was so held that it could move freely, it would perhaps revolve on an imaginary axis, extending from one hand to the other. It is related that on some occasions, when the twig could not revolve, it would be badly twisted and bent, and would even be broken. Much variety is discernible in the accounts, both as to the way of grasping the rod and the latter's behavior. Although Professor Barrett doesn't attempt fully to explain these phenomena, he has clear convictions on one point. He is confident that it is the operator, not the rod, that discovers the water. The movement is not due in genuine cases, he believes, to any attraction or repulsion exerted upon the twig, or the substitute therefor, by the hidden stream, but to muscular action exerted unconsciously in response to some inward inspiration. Some psychologists have been accustomed of late years to assign many human sensibilities and activities to a part of the spiritual nature that lies below the level of consciousness, and which they call the subconscious self. Subliminal is another common name for it. Professor Barrett is inclined to think it possible that the faculty which some people seem to possess of finding water and metals in the manner described resides down in the subliminal, but further investigation is necessary, he admits, to establish that theory. New York Tribune. March 14, 1917. Robinson Constitution, Robinson, Crawford City, Illinois. Witching for water, an ancient superstition described in a government report. The idea that a forked twig, or so-called divining rod, is useful in locating minerals, finding treasure, or detecting criminals is a curious superstition that has been a subject of discussion since the middle of the 16th century and still has a strong hold on the popular mind, even in this country. This is evident from the large number of inquiries received each year by the United States Geological Survey, Department of the Interior, as to the efficiency of such a twig, especially for locating underground water. To furnish a reply to these inquiries, the Geological Survey has published a brief paper by Arthur J. Ellis on the history of water witching, with the bibliography that includes a truly astonishing number of books and pamphlets on this uncanny subject. In summary, the paper states, "It is doubtful whether so much investigation and discussion have been bestowed on any other subject with such absolute lack of positive results. It is difficult to see how, for practical purposes, the entire matter could be thoroughly discredited. It is by no means true that all persons using a forked twig or some other device for locating water or other minerals are intentional deceivers. Some of them are doubtless men of good character and benevolent intentions. However, as anything that can be deeply veiled in mystery affords a good opportunity for swindles, there can be no reasonable doubt that many of the large group of professional finders of water, oil, or other minerals who take pay for their services or for the sale of their instruments are deliberately defrauding the people, and that the total amount of money they obtain is large. To all inquirers, the United States Geological Survey, therefore, gives the advice not to expend any money for the services of any water witch, or for the use or purchase of any machine or instrument devised for locating underground water or other minerals." In tracing the history of the subject, it is found that divining rods have been used 1. To locate ore deposits, 2. To discover buried or hidden treasure, 3. To find lost landmarks and re-establish property boundaries, 4. To detect criminals, 5. To analyze personal character, 6. To cure diseases, 7. To trace lost or strayed domestic animals, 8. To ensure immunity against ill fortune by use as a fetish, 9. To locate well sites, 10. To trace the courses of underground streams, 11. To determine the amount of water available by drilling at a given spot, 12. To determine the depth at which water or ores occur, 13. To determine the direction of cardinal points, 14. To determine the heights of trees, and 15. To analyze ores and water. The origin of the superstition is lost in antiquity. What is believed to be the first published description of the divining rod is contained in Georgius Agricola's De Re Metallica, which was published in 1556. The device became common first in Germany as a means of locating mines and also for discovering buried treasure, a matter of rather common interest in those days, when the practice of burying money and plate for safekeeping was very general. It was introduced into England by German miners during the reign of Elizabeth, 1558 to 1603, and before the end of the 17th century, it had spread through the countries of Europe. Everywhere it aroused controversy. The rules prescribed for the cutting of the twig partook largely of heathen sorcery and astrology. There were indeed, to some extent, unconscious reminiscences of the old Scandinavian and even of the Aryan mythology. This heathen influence was offset when the rod was duly Christianized by baptism being laid for this purpose in the bed with the newly baptized child, by whose Christian name it was afterward addressed. It is readily conceivable the motive for surrounding this practice with a religious atmosphere might not have been altogether a belief in its divine character, for at that time anyone found engaged in mysterious works was in danger of being charged with sorcery and burned to death. The divining rod continued to be a favorite subject with alchemistic writers until about 1660, when a new turn of affairs was brought about by a Jesuit father who denounced it as an instrument controlled by the devil. The subject was then taken up by the Church, and for more than 100 years it was hotly debated by churchmen. Some approved of its use on church property, others condemned it, and threatened those who used it with excommunication. In 1692, the year of the Salem witchcraft, its notoriety was greatly increased by the arrest and execution of a criminal through the agency of a peasant who used a divining rod. Interest in this case was intense and widespread and called forth a large amount of literature. As late as 1703, this peasant was employed to point out, with his divining rod, Protestants for massacre, under the plea of punishment for crimes they had committed. The divining rod was, in some respects, closely related to witchcraft, as is suggested by the use of incantations in connection with divining. Witchcraft, at that time, had become a frenzy, and anything which by any stretch of the imagination could be suspected of implication with witchcraft became a subject of discussion and the basis of firm opinions and beliefs. In 1701, however, the Inquisition issued a decree against the further use of the divining rod in criminal prosecution, and this use of the device rapidly came to an end. In the latter part of the 18th century, an attempt was made to explain water witching as an electric phenomenon, and later it was discussed as a psychic phenomenon. At almost every step in the advance of science, someone has attempted to explain its supposed operation by means of the latest scientific theories. Before the present war, there were several societies in Germany whose sole object was said to be the study of the divining rod. In 1910, the Department of Agriculture of France appointed a committee to investigate the subject, and in 1914 this committee was still investigating. A copy of the government report, which is published as Water Supply Paper 416, can be obtained by addressing the Director, United States Geological Survey, Washington, D.C.